Hi everyone, and welcome to my desperate attempt to accept the supremacy of 3 prize Pokemon. Today, I give you the Phantom Blaster Dragon, who came out of nowhere to terrorize the standard format after the recent rotation. Now, I'm honestly not surprised that Dragapult VMAX has been doing this well in standard, at least. I personally think it's one of the better VMAXs, the better designed ones anyways. It's big, but doesn't necessarily promote a beat stick approach to play. You actually have to plan out your attacks and spread your damage wisely to get the most out of the card. And oh boy, does it open up a lot of interesting plays in Expanded. So this list is my take on Takehito Takechi's Trashapult list. With Chilling Reign and Evolving Skies coming out recently, Dragapult got some fancy new tools, which are part of what's making it so good in Standard. In particular, these tools make it a lot more consistent and give it an ability to bounce back from, an early VMAX getting KO'd in a way that it just wasn't able to do after the loss of Malamar. So jumping right in, we have a 3-2 Dragapult VMAX line, which is what Takehito went with originally. It's just enough to get by, but I will be honest, I'm tempted to run a 3-3 line just because you do prize the 2 Dragapult VMAXs more than you'd like. But that said, these numbers clearly worked well for Takehito, and for the most part, when you don't prize the 2, it usually is enough to get you through the game. Now, Dragapult is obviously your main attacker and is used to spread damage around the board and set up big knockouts for later. Your goal with this guy is not to blow up the enemy Pokemon in one go, and that's really going to happen anyways outside of things that are psychic weak. But you can't even OHKO, believe it or not, a Mewtwo and Mew Tag Team GX because you just miss it by 10 damage, which again is something to keep in mind. Our secondary attacker is the Garbodor from Guardians Rising, which has the fantastic Trashapult attack. It does 20 damage for every item in the enemy discard pile, which means you're often hitting for pretty big numbers given how people love to turbo through their decks in Expanded. It's an extremely cost-efficient attacker, using just 1 energy for Trashapult, and it can even manage to OHKO a number of tag teams if your opponent is not playing conservatively with their items. It's also great to get past things like Decidueye or Pokemon in a similar vein that become immune to VMAX or, Rulebox Pokemon in general. We also have Wobbuffet, which is a fantastic starter thanks to its ability. Bide Barricade essentially provides ability lock as long as it remains in the active spot, but crucially, it does not block psychic abilities, which means that you still get access to Tapu Lele-GX if required, while your opponent, if they're not running a psychic deck, is locked out entirely. Sticking this as your starter with a Chaotic Swell, for example, is often enough to brick your opponents on the first turn or at least slow their setup significantly because they can't Crobat, they can't Dedenne, and back in the day, of course, they wouldn't be able to Shaymin EX either. We also play the Garbotoxin Garbodor to enable full-on ability lock once you attach a tool to it. This can win you games on its own because some decks just do not function without access to abilities. It's really great to slap down in the late game, especially if you're trying to brick an opponent after playing something like a Marnie or an N. Because again, they just can't draw out of it if they don't have access to things like Crobat and Dedenne. And of course, we have the usual core of Lele, Bat, and Rat to help keep the deck consistent. But you do have to be mindful about when you play them, since we have a lot of ability lock going on here. Professor Sycamore, Marnie, and N form our draw package. Sycamore is just good to turbo through your deck, while Marnie is particularly nasty when chained over and over again, limiting your opponent's access to key combo pieces. N is there mostly for the late game to shrink the opponent's hand and hopefully leave them unable to play. Guzma provides a good bit of gusting and pairs well with the heavy Float Stone count we run. This can often be used to strand things in the active under ability lock and force the opponent to waste resources as they try and re-establish or at least reshuffle their board. Pokémon Ranger is here pretty much just to turn off Altered Creation and ensure that you have a fair game versus ADP. Although there are some niche uses like getting around the omnipresent Galarian Stunfisk Vs, which seem to be swarming the expanded ladder these days. And Raihan gives you some energy acceleration and an Omni Search on the condition that something was KO'd by damage from an attack the previous turn. It can essentially let you use a Max Phantom out of nowhere if your last VMAX got knocked out and you already had the energy in hand for your turn attachment. But it could also be used to let you grab an extender like the Dedenne-GX, for example, if your board is already fairly well established, or, you can't play your draw supporter since you just used Raihan. 4 VS Seeker is pretty standard and lets us toolbox our supporters fairly well. Our Pokeball package consists of Quick Ball, Fog Crystal, and Mysterious Treasure. Quick Ball obviously gets you your basics, and more often than not your Bat, Rat, or Lele, while usually dumping a supporter that you can get back with VS Seeker later. Fog Crystal is a free search for a basic Psychic Pokemon, or basic Psychic Energy, which usually means that you're going to get the turn 1 Dragapult V and turn 1 attachment. It's also a free out to Lele, which is nice. And Mysterious Treasure is a Psychic type Omni Search, typically grabbing the VMAX or one of our Garbodors. Enhanced Hammer is super useful in Expanded where special energy runs rampant, and it can often be used to buy you a turn. Field Blower is there to counter other Garbodors mostly, but it can also remove pesky HP buffing tools like Fighting Fury Belt, or, most importantly, damage counter denial like Big Parasol or Metal Goggles. You can also blow off your own tools, your Float Stones in this case, if you need to turn off Garbotoxin for at least a turn or even just for a little chunk of that turn. A Rescue Stretcher provides some recovery in a pinch, typically getting back pieces of the Garbodor line or a VMAX in games where one of them might be prized and you just have to get it back to keep up the pressure. 4 Float Stones are a must to make Garbotoxin live, but are also used to get Wobbuffet out of the active when its use is up, or you just really need to play something like your own Dedenne or Crobat V. 2 Chaotic Swells ensure that the opponent usually won't win the Stadium War. This plus Wobbuffet or Garbotoxin can usually spell serious trouble for the opponent at any point in the game, and I do like the 2 count here because even though for the most part people only run 1 or 2 stadiums, and this will typically bump one and then get rid of the other because it bumps it as well when they play it down, I kind of just like to have the extra little bit of insurance, especially because some decks do run extremely high stadium counts, like your giant Hearth engines, or things back in the day like Night March would run a very heavy Dimension Valley count. And you want the ability to continuously deny those throughout the game with your ability lock to just make sure your opponent cannot get the ideal setup at all. And finally, we run a 5-4 split of basic Psychic Energy and Horror Energy. I personally love Horror Energy because it can fix the math for Dragapult's attacks, and even allow you to steal KOs when you're in a particularly tricky spot. I like 9 energy in total because any lower than that and you do risk missing the turn 1 attachment, even with all of your outs to it. This count basically ensures a nice, healthy supply of energy throughout the game, which usually means that you won't miss the attack, which can be game-ending in Expanded, especially with Dragapult VMAX's low initial damage output. And that's the deck. I personally love this kind of deck because it's not about blowing your opponent up with your big 3-prize beat stick. Instead, it plays the long game, setting up KOs around the board and slowly removing your opponent's options until you effectively checkmate them. I'm also just a huge Garbodor stan, so having it as a partner to Dragapult and a 1-prize partner at that is just wonderful. Now, I will say that this deck's matchups are pretty good overall, but I feel like, at least in my experience, you take the hard loss to things like Turbo Dark or Eternatus because you have no way of mitigating your weakness, and in most cases, thanks to Dark-type resistance to Psychic attackers, you're often missing out on the 2 KO, while they will blow you up in one shot in return. Oh, and things like Togekiss and Blissey. The big fairies are just too fat, can heal up, and will typically grind you out before you can even KO a single one. But hey, if you avoid the big white and pink blobs, then you're probably golden. And with all of that out of the way, let's jump into some matches and see how this deck rolls. Okay, so our first match on the expanded ladder today is against something that's 99% as salt-inducing as Pheromosa Donk or Honchkrow. But at least this particular deck gives you the opportunity to have a little bit of counterplay, so hey, things can always be worse. And it's actually a really good lesson here in why you don't always necessarily need to evolve up your VMAXs, and why maybe the 2 count here is good enough in a deck like this, given how cheesy expanded as a meta can kind of be. So what I'm playing against today is Raticate Poison. So basically the idea of the deck is to use these really cheap attackers in Raticate and Raticate Break to use something like Super Fang or Hyper Fang, which places damage counters on your Pokemon until they just have 10 HP left, and then basically you finish off your opponents using the poison damage from something like a Hypnotoxic Laser or the effect of Ariados or the Garbodor out of Darkness Ablaze. So starting off, I got my ideal Wobbuffet and Chaotic Swell start, which basically means that my opponent can't use Jirachi, at least right off the bat. They're basically forced to burn the Escape Rope and throw up their Rattata, I think, which does have free retreat as is, so, you know, they are able to eventually get off the effect, but it's at the inconvenience of having to play something I'm sure they wanted to use later as basically a pseudo Gust. Now, basically looking at where things are, in this particular matchup, like I mentioned, it's maybe not the best idea to evolve up into your VMAX, specifically because once they get the combo going, they can finish you off pretty quickly and take an easy 3 prizes while you're only revenge KOing them for 1. So basically in this matchup, what I need to do is rely on my Trashapult Garbodors, using them as cheap 1 prize attackers to basically blow through my opponent, whittle down their counts of Rattatas and Raticates, and eventually get them to a point where there's just 2 really small Pokemon left on the bench, where a Max Phantom can take an easy 2 prizes for the final KO. Now, it didn't end up playing out that way, but thankfully I still exercised a lot of really good restraint, and it basically managed to carry me through the game. Now, the nice thing here about getting to go first was that I basically got to evolve up my guys first and get in the first attack, which is really important in a matchup like this because I have to get them down to 2 prizes as quickly as possible if I wanted to take that Max Phantom route at the end of the game. Right? But again, as much as possible, you just want to make that prize trade really, really efficient. I have to, at least with my 1 prizers, make sure that I keep the 1 KO per turn, because they're going to be able to loop their attackers over and over again. They've got pretty easy access to recovery through things like Rescue Stretcher. Some of these decks play Ordinary Rod when they do run the odd basic energy. But me, myself, I only have the 2 Trashapult Garbodors, so I have to be very stingy with things like my Rescue Stretcher in order to ensure that I'm getting off that cheap 1 prize attack every turn. Now, my opponent is sort of making things easier for me as well, because they're burning a lot of items pretty early on, and their Pokemon are really low HP, so once they've burned a couple of them actually, I'm able to take a one-shot on pretty much everything with Trashapult. I think the Raticates only have 60 or 70 HP, so 4 items is going to do it, and the Raticate Break, which is a little bit bigger, would take 5 or 6, I believe. Now, I got really lucky here in that my opponent actually whiffed the sleep on the Hypnotoxic Laser, which is actually kind of huge because it meant that I got an extra turn out of this Garbodor, and it gave me the time to establish another one without having to worry about, you know, maybe digging for something else, getting another draw supporter, and scrambling basically to get my stuff set up. Because as it is, while Dragapult VMAX can take a 1-hit KO, I believe on the Raticates using Shred, it's again not the way I want to go because then I'm giving up 3 prizes essentially for 1. But luckily again, I did manage to dodge that poor prize trade. I forced my opponent to burn another laser if they want to take the KO here, and of course they're also losing the resource of the 2 Pokemon pieces and the 1 energy as well. Now, they actually go into the Raticate Break here, I think to try and deny me the damage, but they'd played down a sufficient number of items, and I did take the time to just double check there to make sure that I could basically guarantee the KO when I went in. Alright, and there we go. I'm just going to grab back the Garbodor because that's really, really important. I would have liked to return both pieces back to the deck, but I just wasn't sure that I was going to hit them off of the Sycamore, so better to guarantee myself the attacker there. Now, I also throw down the Field Blower, just in case I have to take the KO on that Mew. I don't want to give them the easy draw 7 and potentially let them draw into more combo pieces. Now here I did get a little bit greedy, arguably this was a mistake, but realizing that I couldn't use Raihan and getting a little worried about how, you know, consistently I was going to be able to keep on with the Garbodor attacks, I did grab another Dragapult V, and I do believe I bench it eventually, which would give my opponent access to an easy 6 prizes if they were able to continue their combo. Now, luckily for me too, my opponent is burning those valuable resources in trying to take out my Garbodors. They've played down a couple Hypnotoxic Lasers already, they've gone through quite a few Special Energy, and they've also burned through quite a few Raticates as well. I don't believe they played any Recovery by this point either, so I knew there would only be 1, maybe 2 of those left in the deck, which made me feel pretty good about my chances going forward, especially since the Raticate itself takes 3 colorless energy to get that attack off. So, you know, with the 3 CE there, that's limited to maybe 4 copies in the deck, not sure how many they've prized. So again, I can just slowly whittle down the resources, force them to go through my Garbodors, and eventually, if I'm lucky, what they'll do is with the evolution or the attack, which will basically give me that prize trade buffer in order to set up that Dragapult play. Now, the only thing that didn't go according to plan here was that I kept forgetting that Raihan does not trigger because the poison damage is actually what finishes you off. I was basically thinking, okay, once my final Trashapult Garbodor goes down, I'll just Raihan to really quickly charge up the VMAX and go in for the Max Phantom, but obviously you can't actually do that. So I opt instead, once I realize my mistake, to just kind of muscle my way through with Garbodor, pray that at least on this turn they whiff, and then basically I'll get my attachment next turn into the V. I can go up there, hopefully take a KO, and again, maybe they don't have a Rattata to evolve up. Now, my opponent did manage to get another one on board, which basically meant they had the guaranteed Raticate next turn. But when the 3rd or 4th Hypnotoxic Laser comes down, I started feeling pretty comfortable that they didn't have what they needed, and the fact that they went for that attack means that they didn't have the Raticate to go into. So now at this point, I'm able to deny them a little bit of energy, I'm able to get the attachment onto Dragapult, and with them only having a 3-card hand going into 4 eventually, I was fairly certain that unless they drew into, you know, a boss and for whatever reason they held on to the Raticate, they just weren't going to be able to both establish the Raticate and gust up my Dragapult, and of course get the poison damage that they would need to actually finish it off as well. And right there, that basically happens. At this point, the game was pretty much over anyways because killing a VMAX still wouldn't do it, but I was basically able to go in and pretty easily take the KO just to kind of finish things up, with my Garbodors actually carrying me all the way through. Okay, and our next matchup is one that actually should have gone a lot easier, but admittedly because of some pretty greedy and careless play on my part, I ended up making this a lot harder than it actually had to be. Still honestly a favorable matchup because you're at least at the outset playing against weakness, and I have access to ability lock, but oh boy, yeah, I could have finished this one a lot quicker. So we're basically going up against Mew 3, which is an extremely powerful deck in Expanded. It was busted the whole time it was in Standard, because hey, copying any GX attack is great, but in Expanded you have access to a lot more GX attacks as well as the attacks of EXs as well, and all the consistency tools you need to kind of thin your deck, drop those pieces into the discard pile, and just start going. Also, crazy access to special energy like Prism Energy, which is just busted alongside tag teams. So pretty early on, I do see the Mew 3 come out, and this is one of the first mistakes I'd made. I kind of wanted to force my opponent to expend resources. I didn't want them to hold on to the 1 or 2 Field Blowers that they usually have, so I decided to play down a Float Stone early onto the Trubbish to basically say, hey, if you don't maybe burn through your deck a little bit more and dig for that Field Blower, I'm going to ability lock you and make this all worthless at the end of the day. Didn't end up paying off because while I don't believe that I prized any of them, I ended up not really seeing my Float Stones too much throughout the rest of the match. So losing that one early on actually ended up hurting and adding, I would say, at least 3 or 4 turns to this match that otherwise didn't need to be there. Especially because now the Mewtwo would have access to, ultimately if it had to, healing, and once my opponent got down the Jirachi GX like they did there, the advantage that I had in hitting for weakness was effectively gone. Now, the good news was that my opponent still couldn't really take a KO early on, and with that Giratina stuck in the active, I would be able to take a pretty easy prize and start accumulating damage counters onto the Mewtwo, with the presumption that eventually, you know, I would find another Float Stone and basically secure myself a pretty easy one-hit KO with those pre-existing damage counters. Now, getting the second Trubbish down was really good as well, because it basically means that now I can threaten the Trashapult as well as the Garbotoxin, and that was really important in this case because even if I'm not hitting for weakness, but hey, if I could find a way to turn off Jirachi even better, this is basically a way to chunk or outright OHKO the Mew Mew, you know, if the right circumstances appeared. Now, the Enhanced Hammer a little earlier came in clutch as well, because one thing that kind of kept me in this game was my ability to constantly slow down my opponent by denying them energy or denying them ways to kind of cheat the cost of their attacks. I was basically able to ensure that the Mew Mew could not get off some of the more destructive attacks that would have really put me behind. The big one that I was really worried about in particular was Mew Mew's own GX attack, Miraculous Duo, which would have completely healed it, and thanks to Dragapult VMAX's low damage output and, you know, Jirachi's existence, that would have basically made getting the one-hit KO or even a two-hit KO pretty impossible, outside of something like a Horror Energy ping a little bit prior. So my opponent's basically just going to start burning through their deck here. They're going to try, of course, and get as many GXs and EXs into the discard pile as possible to give them access to some really good attacks. I did not like seeing the Vileplume GX there because basically it's big. I think it's the Big Bloom attack. It's pretty easy, 180 damage for 2 energy. You know, you do lose 10 damage for every damage counter on there, and thankfully I had pinged the Mewtwo before, so it's not necessarily going to be the most effective thing. But what my opponent did have access to, thanks to Noivern being in the discard pile, was Distort, which basically let them item lock me, which was really unfortunate. So the only thing I can do is go for the Marnie and basically try to limit my opponent's resources a little bit. I am able to establish the Garbodor as well and get some key damage in there and start threatening the Jirachi as well. Now, one thing that's making this match a lot trickier for me as well is the fact that that Dimension Valley only benefits my opponent. I have nothing but Psychic in my attack costs, which means I can't benefit from it, but my opponent is able to pretty easily get good use out of there. Now, in this particular case, my opponent, what they should have done probably is go for the Miraculous Duo here, but instead they wanted to take the KO with Calamitous Slash, which I think really ended up hurting them in the long run. Because by doing that, you know, they basically ensured that I had the means to OHKO them here. Now, obviously, you know, they are 3 prizes ahead, or at least 2, but by setting up the Garbodor and not being under item lock anymore, I was basically able to threaten them with a follow-up Trashapult as well, and just say, okay, well, I don't necessarily need to get another VMAX up in order to take the match. Yeah, you know, weakness isn't really going to be a factor here, but your first Mewtwo is weakened enough. And, you know, even if you take out my second Trashapult, I'm probably going to have just enough in there to, you know, Raihan and then Max Phantom for a KO or close enough to it anyways. But again, I could have made this a lot easier on myself, and if my opponent is able to pull off the Miraculous Duo, then all of that wonderful math and planning goes right out the window. So I go in, take the pretty easy KO on here because I am able to establish Garbotoxin at least for a little bit. Weakness didn't end up mattering too much, obviously, at that high threshold of damage. But, you know, my opponent had been a little bit careless as well. They had played way too many items down, so now Garbodor was to the point where, with just another item or 2 in the discard pile, it's basically OHKOing a good number of the tag teams that my opponent could, in theory, play. Now, the second Field Blower comes down. You know, again, not the greatest thing in the world, but I'm thinking, okay, I forced them to do that again. If I can get my next Trashapult into play, they've basically given me the KO. Now, my opponent, of course, being smart and always playing to their outs, went to fetch the Lele. Didn't end up actually playing it down because I think they were worried about having the vulnerable bench sitter, or maybe they just wanted to thin the deck out a little bit more because they ended up hitting the end that they needed to anyways with that Dedenne change there. They also reestablished the Dimension Valley, but thankfully this new Mew 3 is down to just 1 Prism energy, so it's not really going to be able to threaten me with the Miraculous Duo, not that it would matter at this point anyways. That Fighting Fury belt, however, did suck particularly because it gave him the extra HP he needed to survive a Trashalanche and then potentially a follow-up Shred or Bite, which is what I was going to have to resort to given my options here. Now, thankfully, I did get the 2 Chaotic Swells, and this is part of the reason why I like to run the 2, because you just never see the 1 often enough, and being able to bounce that Dimension Valley here and ensure that a follow-up was not coming down is actually, I think, what ended up winning me the match. My opponent also forgot that by turning on his Jirachi again and going for the Distort to lock me out of items and hopefully brick me, he also turned off my Trashalanche Garbodor's weakness to his Distort attack, which means that I was able to basically go in for huge damage, and thanks to the attachment of that Horror Psychic Energy and the fact that he really lacked any cards in hand, he essentially checkmated himself and he ends up falling on his sword, which gives me the game. Alright, so altogether, I think Trashapult as an archetype is still a very fierce competitor in Expanded, and I think under a more talented pilot than myself, I can definitely see how it's able to wreak havoc out there at some of the bigger tournaments. Now that said, because it's not just a big beater deck, I actually think I'm getting the hang of piloting something like this that does require a bit more planning, and at least making very careful plays to minimize your opponent's outs to victory. Again, while I made that match against the Mew Mew deck a lot longer than it needed to be, I also think that, you know, I was able to kind of steal the win away from my opponent by forcing them to do undesirable things like burn through their deck a little bit more, dig for things like the Field Blower, put more items in the discard pile, to the point where even if I didn't have the VMAX, I was basically going to be able to close that game out. And, you know, it ended up working out that way. I think I pretty much had my follow-up guaranteed, even if I had to attack with the Trubbish. Funny enough, if my opponent had managed to reestablish the Dimension Valley, I actually think I could have gone in there and taken the KO with, I think the attack is Drool. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'll have to remember the math on that and whether or not Psychic Zone was a factor at the time, but I'm pretty sure I would have gotten the knockout. But anyway, what I wanted to kind of say by, you know, focusing on Dragapult here is, of course, it's still fantastic, and in the absence of crazy stuff like Turbo Dark and Eternatus, it's just a fantastic deck overall, and I really wish we got more VMAXs like this. You are starting to see it a little bit more, as much as I don't like Urshifu because it's just a ton of damage as opposed to the snipe, like, you know, Gale Thrust, yes, it makes you discard all your energy, but I mean, come on, it's not that big of a deal. You're just dealing so much more that it kind of, outside of, you know, the favorability of psychic type attackers in certain matchups, just makes Urshifu a better choice than Dragapult. But you know, like, it's just kind of fair. 130 damage for 2 energy, yeah, it's pretty good, but given how large HP stats are, how big certain tag teams actually were, and definitely how big the VMAXs are, that's not necessarily just a card that you can slap down and brute force your way through to a victory in a way that you can with something like Ice Rider, for example, right? Where, you know, the only kind of interesting stuff you're doing is maybe using Inteleon pings and deciding, hey, I can use Ride of the High King instead to, you know, take the KO on a weakened Pokemon, right? VMAXs like this, it's really cool because it allows for a little bit of counterplay, even though I had the weakness advantage temporarily in that latter match. You know, my opponent could avoid the 2-hit KO, at least, you know, eliminating all damage modifiers and all that. So we could actually have a little bit of back and forth, right? And that's what I really like about this particular card and decks that play like this, right? I much prefer something like this to Centiskorch VMAX, which is literally just pile on the energy and blow shit up. So we'll see. We are starting to see more cards like this as well. Jolteon VMAX, for example, I really like it. It spreads damage in a really interesting way. You need to have the damage counters there already. So if we can see more Pokemon like this, or even Blaziken VMAX, which while not doing damage to the bench, does provide energy acceleration in exchange for its relatively lower damage output. Like, I want to see more VMAXs like this where they're taking 3-hit KOs on each other, funny enough, but also changing the board state enough that your other attackers, potentially your 2 prizes and your 1 prizers, can kind of come in there as well and contribute to your overall game plan, right? You're not just saying, I evolved up first, I attacked first, I blew up your VMAX first, ergo, I'm pretty much going to win every time. But let's see, I want to take this deck for a spin a little bit more. I want to see if there are any counts that I can adjust to make it a little bit more efficient. Maybe I'm going to run a few more Trashalanches as well, because I actually find that it's really, really carrying a lot of the games. You don't actually need the third VMAX most of the time. Sometimes you just need one, which was certainly the case, at least in the latter match, and it didn't even really come up in the first. So, I don't know. Let's see. I really love this deck. I'm going to try and play it a little bit more. I don't know if it's necessarily going to be my main for Expanded, because there's one other that I'm testing that you guys will get to see in about a week or two, but still really good feels so far. So that's pretty much it for this episode. You guys know the drill by now. If you enjoyed the video, like it, leave a comment, and subscribe if you haven't already. And in particular, if you guys have any recommendations about any tweaks that I could make to the list, any interesting tech cards that I may be missing out on, particularly if you have a way to help against the dark type matchup, I would really love to know. But beyond that, I will leave you guys to enjoy what's left of your day. And so until next time, take it easy.